I have to say, going through this stuff, I have nightmares about it, and I hope you don't have them as well, but you probably will. So coherent, so electromagnetic fields is what we're going to be talking about and how they impact our bodies. And one thing that's very important is that electronically generated EMFs are coherent. That is, they're put out in a particular vector direction with a particular frequency, phase, and polarity. And for all of those reasons, they produce very strong electric and time-varying magnetic forces, which can then impact the cells of our bodies. Most natural EMFs are incoherent and basically produce only minuscule forces. So this coherence is very important, and it is essential for the ability to use EMFs for wireless communication. So the same thing that causes impacts on our bodies is the same thing which is required for wireless communication. And so we're going to be talking about that, and we're also going to be talking about the role of pulsation, because wireless communication uses modulating pulses to communicate the information. And those modulating pulses make these EMFs much more biologically active, basically because the peak intensities are the crucial thing, not the average intensity. So, okay, let's see. How do I, oh, okay. So the first paper that I published on EMS was published in 2013. And it showed that there were a large number of studies where non-thermal effects of microwave and also other frequency EMFs could be blocked or greatly lowered by what are known as calcium channel blockers. These are blockers that are specific for blocking what are called voltage-gated calcium channels, or VGCCs. And what those studies show is that the EMFs are acting by activating these VGCCs, and therefore, if you block them, you can block the effects, or at least greatly lower the effects. Now, that paper has been now cited 400 times in the according to Google Scholar. So it's been very widely recognized. This mechanism is very widely recognized in the scientific community, as shown by this very large numbers of citations. And so, so that's important. And now what I'm going to do is kind of outline for you how this thing works. And this is going to be a little bit esoteric, but the basic idea is that those channels, and let me say it's not just the calcium channels, but they're also voltage-gated sodium channels and potassium channels and chloride channels that are also activated by the EMFs, but most of the effects are produced through the calcium channels. And they have a structure called the voltage sensor, and they contain a bunch of helices in 4 different domains. So if you look at this structure and this structure and this one that's going off the screen here, they're very, very similar. So there are 4 of them, and there are 4 helices, S4 helices, that have a lot of positive charges on them. And it's those positive charges on these helices, this one, this one, this one, and that one, that where the forces act to to cause these things to ratchet out away from the center, open the channel, and allow then ions to flow through into the cell. So we know a lot about how this thing works, and what I'm arguing is that both the electric forces on the EMFs, and also the time-varying magnetic forces, which are also very important, act on those charges, on the charges on this helix and that helix, and that then something happened here. Okay, so how then let's see, close that, yeah, okay. How then do you get biological effects? And the biological effects are all sort of described in this figure. So we have a variety of different EMFs here. They put forces on these voltage-gated calcium channels, VGCCs, and they activate them. They open the channel, and you get large amounts of calcium flowing into the cell. And so you get very large increases in intracellular calcium as a consequence of that. Now, part of the reason why calcium flows into the cell is because typically in the cells of our bodies, under most conditions, the calcium outside the cell is about 10,000 times higher than the calcium inside the cell. So there's a huge flux of calcium going into the cell. And when that happens, you get pathophysiological effects shown here, that is damaging effects in the body. And they're produced mainly through two main pathways, this one and this one here. One of them is calcium signaling. So calcium signaling is very, very important in the cells of the human body and the cells of all animals and all plants and probably a lot of other organisms as well. And if you get excessive calcium signaling, that can produce pathophysiological effects. And then there's a second pathway that goes on here where you get increases in, and let me say, you don't need to remember all this stuff. What I'm trying to tell you is we know a lot about the specifics of what's going on here. You get increases in nitric oxide and superoxide, and these two react with each other very, very rapidly to form this guy, peroxynitrite. Peroxynitrite is a potent oxidant. It's not a free radical, but it breaks down to form highly reactive free radicals over here. And they, in turn, produce oxidative stress, and they activate NF-kappa B and produce inflammation. And I think probably all of these things have been discussed in other talks here. And so they then all contribute to the pathophysiological effects that occur. Interestingly, when you have modest increases in intracellular calcium instead of very large ones, you can also trigger a therapeutic pathway through nitric oxide signaling and raising the level of NRF2, and that then produces therapeutic effects. This therapeutic pathway produces effects that are almost exactly opposite what you get from the peroxynitrite oxidative stress inflammation pathway. So what that means, under different circumstances, you can get almost opposite effects from EMFs, depending on how big this calcium increase is, okay? Now there's one other thing in here that I want to mention to you, and that is that nitric oxide also has other effects, and one of them, and nitric oxide binds to cytochromes, and it can inhibit their activities. And so one of the groups of cytochromes that are important are cytochrome P450s, and they then are blocked by nitric oxide. And what do they do? Well, one thing that cytochrome P450s do is they help detoxify the body from toxic carbon-containing compounds. So, so there can be a synergy between the EMFs and the and chemicals for that reason. And I'm going to talk later on about a second kind of way in which they connect synergistically as well. So I just want to, okay, so we have a lot of information about how this whole thing works in it. And the reason, oops, I'm not, oh, what's happening here? I don't understand why my, okay, let me.
Oh, Martin, if you want, you can, and you hear,
Yeah.
oh, maybe you just need to, yeah.
Let me, no, it doesn't want to escape. Oh, now it's going. Okay. All right. So, okay, so this paper that I published on the how you get penetrating effects, and it has to do with the coherence of these EMFs, and was published last year in May, and it's a very important paper for showing us not only sort of basic properties, but also specifically how you get highly penetrating effects, even from millimeter waves, that where the electric fields don't penetrate well, but the magnetic fields are highly penetrating. So anyway, so what we have here is a number of important things, and I've already mentioned most of them. Whereas electronically generated EMFs are coherent, most natural EMFs are incoherent. And so they only produce minuscule forces in comparison with the very large forces from the electronically generated EMFs. So that's a very important difference. It's the peak forces that produce most of the effects. And we know that from these pulsations. They are produced by these highly pulsed EMFs are much more biologically active than our non-pulsed EMFs of the same average intensities. And average intensities, which are the basis of the safety guidelines, tell you nothing about safety. So it's the peak levels, the highest levels that are the most important. So you get a number of highly penetrating effects from millimeter waves, even though the industry says you cannot get them, and that's and I discussed a number of these in here, and I'll talk about some of those later on as well. So modulating EMFs, which are used to carry information in all wireless communication except for FM radio, are very important in terms of producing much higher effects. And so the same things that are important for wireless communication are important for producing maximum effects in our bodies. And this is, you know, and as I said before, average intensities are the basis of all the safety guidelines, and they simply cannot be used to predict biological effects. They simply don't work. 5G is designed to be extraordinarily highly pulsed in order to carry vast amounts of information. And that's the basis, that's the primary basis of the concern for 5G, is that it because of its properties, it produces you know, very, very high effects, biological effects. Okay. Okay, I think I've already discussed all of those things, so let's go on. Let me just say, the industry, this is a multi-trillion-dollar industry, the telecom industry, has been very active in attacking individual scientists who came up with findings that they didn't like. And so there's been character assassination against a very large number of scientists. This thing really started with Dr. Henry Lai in 1994 when he started seeing DNA effects. And Dr. Lai has been important in other ways as well. And they've also attacked, had personality assassination attacks on all of these people that I've listed here. And I suspect there are others that should be included. And each of these people has had a distinguished scientific career. The only reason they're being attacked is because they had important findings the telecom industry did not like. So anyway, I've had recent attacks, and I take it as a badge of honor that that is the case. However unpleasant and difficult it makes the situation. So this document, the FCC is a captured agency. How the Federal Communications Commission is dominated by the industries it presumably regulates. This was published by the Harvard Institute for Ethics, and it tells you something about how the most important regulatory agency in the U.S. is supposed to be protecting us. In fact, is not. And so EMFs have higher effects in children than in adults. And there are 4 reasons why this is true. One is that children have much higher surface to volume ratios, so their tissues, including their brains, are more exposed to the EMFs. A second is that children have much higher densities of stem cells, and the stem cells are particularly sensitive to the EMFs. Has been discussed in some detail by Dr. Igor Belyaev. The developing brain appears to be especially sensitive to EMFs, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why that is later on. And young tissues have much greater extracellular water content than do older tissues, and that leads to deeper penetration of the effects, and this has been discussed by Dr. Deborah Davis. So there's, so we have particular concerns about Wi-Fi and cell phone tower radiation in schools for these reasons. And this is another issue that needs to be considered. Okay, now what I'm going to be discussing here are 8 possible, and I would argue highly plausible, EMF caused existential threats to our survival. In other words, each of these individually is, in my judgment, a potentially serious threat to our survival, and from effects of EMFs in people. And before doing that, however, what I will first discuss is 9 different very well documented effects of low intensity non-thermal EMF exposures. So these have nothing to, let me say, the FCC and the regulatory agencies and the industry only recognize heating in terms of effects. And as you've already seen, that's not the way EMFs work. So I'm going to talk about these. These are things that have been extensively documented, and some of these are central to the sort of nightmare scenarios that I'm going to talk about with regard to existential threats. Some of them are not, and so the ones that are the ones that are outlined here. So there are a large number of published review articles that basically show that EMFs produce lowered fertility, and so they change the structure of the testis and the ovaries. They produce lowered sperm count, motility, and quality, and I'll talk about those in a little bit more detail. A lower number of follicles, and increased spontaneous abortion, lowered levels of the 3 sex hormones, lowered libido. So almost anything you can think of that has to do with with fertility is negatively impacted by EMFs. The good majority of the studies have been on male fertility, and I'm going to talk about those in at least a little bit of detail later on, because male fertility is much easier to study, and that's part of that's the main reason why it's been more studied. But we have, as I say, there are there are effects in females as well that are demonstrated in animal studies and in some cases in humans. There are also neurological, neuropsychiatric effects. There are 35 reviews on those. There are many changes in neurotransmitter activity. The things that I'm going to concentrate on, and I'll discuss them later on in a little more detail, are what appear to be the neuropsychiatric effects: insomnia, fatigue, depression, headaches, lack of concentration, cognitive dysfunction, anxiety, agitation, memory dysfunction, etc. I mean, these are all things that, as I think you all know, are very common in our society. We complain about them all the time. We know they're caused by EMFs, and nobody pays any attention to them. Well, that's a slight exaggeration, but it's pretty close to true. There are also cellular DNA damage of 3 different types, and I'll talk about these as well later on. And these can have roles both in causing cancer and in causing germline mutations. And both of those are extremely important. You get increases in apoptosis, programmed cell death, 16 published reviews on that. You get oxidative stress and free radical damage. We already talked about those a bit from the peroxynitrite pathway. You get endocrine, that is hormonal effects. And as far as I can tell, every single hormone system in the body is impacted by EMFs. Not always the same way. You do get effects, both the non-steroid and the steroid hormones, and are affected and by EMFs. You get excessive intracellular calcium, which, as I've already told you, is probably the underlying cause of almost everything else. Not quite. In fact, some of the studies have shown that the sodium channels can be important as well in producing some effects, some specific effects. I won't talk about those. The cancer, you get, there are 44 published reviews arguing that cancer is caused by EMFs, and that it involves the initiation of carcinogenesis. Those are the DNA effects, tumor promotion and progression, including increased tissue invasion and metastasis. The whole pattern, the whole gamut of things that are involved in cancer causation are stimulated by EMFs. There are 44 reviews on that. The only reason why we're still arguing about whether EMFs cause cancer is because the industry has so much money and so much power that they can, I mean, there's been huge numbers of review articles that have shown there's a very large and diverse literature showing that EMFs do all of these kinds of things. There are cardiac effects on the electrical control of the heart, and I'll talk about those also in some detail as we go on. And so these are not the only things that EMFs do. In fact, I'll talk about some other things that they do later on. But these are the ones that are most extensively documented. And I think they're obviously very important, each of them individually. So how are we? Okay. So, okay, so what I'm going to do is talk about these can I? Oh, I don't know. Okay. I can't see some of my screen here because this thing is on here, but anyway. Okay, so I published a paper in 2016 on the what I call the neuropsychiatric effects. So some of these are just basically neurological effects, but can't sleep, tired all the time, depressed, fatigued. Dysesthesia has to do with sensory perception. The sensory organs don't work properly, and they are not all impacted in the same individual. Concentration, attention, dysfunction, memory changes, that is, the memory doesn't work well, dizziness, irritability, loss of appetite and body weight. And by the way, you can also get increases in body weight as well from EMFs under different conditions. Restlessness, anxiety, nausea, skin burning, tingling. Dermographism is a peculiar thing where your skin is very sensitive to touching it. Tinnitus. One of the things that's been, so most of these have been studied in epidemiology, although the evidence for causation is very strong, even from the epidemiology. But the one thing that's been studied most experimentally is EEG changes. There are 38 different studies that have been done, experimental studies where different EMFs have been used and where there are changes in the EEGs in the human brain. And so, and those of course measure the electrical activity in the human brain, which is the most important thing that goes on in the brain. And so what's clear is experimentally, EMFs, low intensity EMFs of the sort that the industry claims can't possibly do anything, are producing changes in the electrical activity in the human brain. And those in turn, presumably, are involved in producing all of these kinds of effects that we see. And so this was, the review that I published, but there are also 11 additional reviews that found similar sets of effects, not necessarily all of these, but a substantial number of them, from EMF effects, from different kinds of EMFs, including cell phones, and 5 of them involve reviews of people living near cell phone towers having these kinds of neuropsychiatric effects. So, so there should be no question that cell phone tower radiation impacts our brains. Now, back in the 1970s and 1980s, there were a whole series of occupational exposure studies done on effects of occupational EMF occupational exposures on people. And let me say, back in those days, there were essentially no common EMF exposures out in the general environment. So you didn't have to worry about what other EMFs they're getting exposed to. They're just getting exposed to the EMFs associated with their occupation, and so one can look at what happens in those situations. And what was found in a number of those studies is that the effects are cumulative. That is, you start effects slowly over time, but they get more and more severe with time to exposure to a particular level and type of EMF. And so that tells you some very important things. And it tells you specifically that you develop these, and sometimes they took years to develop, sometimes they took months to develop. And of course, now we have many other things where things tend to work, at least in some cases, more rapidly. But what, but there are two things about this. One is that we are insensitive to things that occur slowly to us. we're not aware of them. And so it's very important that these studies have been done, because they clearly show causation, and they clearly show that you can develop things over time, and they can become more and more severe with time. And so when you have these different kinds of neuropsychiatric effects occurring from EMFs, and they get worse and worse with time to the same type of exposures, then of course what's going to happen when you introduce much newer, more highly pulsed, and much more biologically active EMFs is that things are going to get much worse much faster. And so I am very concerned that we are on a process which is leading to a crash of our collective brain function. And everything in our society is based on our collective brain function. So, you know, we're just going to go into utter chaos if this continues in the way that we are going. And so this is something that this is one of my nightmare scenarios. It's one of 8 of them. And it may be the worst of them, or maybe not. So, okay. So let's talk about Alzheimer's disease and neurodegeneration. And I published this article just a little while ago. It just came out in current Alzheimer research, and on how low intensity EMFs act via VGCC activation to cause very early onset Alzheimer's disease, and 18 different distinct types of evidence. And so we don't have time to talk about all those 18, but we're going to talk about half of them, I guess. Okay. So this thing starts, I think my numbering got screwed up here. It starts with the confluence of 2 findings. One is what's called the calcium hypothesis of Alzheimer's disease. And that's been published repeatedly over the last 25 years. And what it argues is that we have okay, so I see somebody's raising a hand. What do I do? Click on it? Okay, I just unmuted you. Marcus? Hello?
Yes, hello. You hear me?
I hear you, yes.
Okay. Dr. Pell, I didn't intend this question in the middle of the presentation, but now that that I get the opportunity, I will ask.
Okay.
Are you aware of the worldwide hum? Many people over the world perceive this as a low throbbing, a low frequency noise. Do you think there's any relationship with EMFs?
I guess I'm not aware of that.
There's many accounts of people perceiving low frequency noise without an actual source.
Okay. So I can answer that. There is a phenomenon that's well described called microwave hearing, in which people hear things where there's no actual sound, and where the EMFs are almost certainly interacting directly with the hearing mechanism. And so there is, that does exist. It's been shown to exist, and so it may be involved here. Okay. That's all I can say. Now, I mean, the properties of microwave radiation, which is usually used are different from the properties of sound. And so you can usually tell that it's not a real sound as a consequence of that, but that's about all I can say. Okay. All right. So I'm going to go back and mute you again. And okay, so let's okay, so we have a confluence of two findings. One is the calcium hypothesis of Alzheimer's disease, basically argues excessive intracellular calcium is the central cause of Alzheimer's disease. And the other is, of course, EMFs acting by a VGCC activation, where the first thing that happens in the cells of our bodies is we get increases in intracellular calcium. So that makes a strong argument. And there's a second observation, which I documented in my paper, which is that both EMFs and excessive intracellular calcium cause each of the most important changes that are involved in causing Alzheimer's disease. And that includes all the things that are involved in producing the amyloid beta protein, but also other things which are involved in producing other features of Alzheimer's disease, which are shared with other neurodegenerative diseases. So calcium may have roles not only in Alzheimer's, but also in all the neurodegenerative disease central roles. And in Alzheimer's, VGCC activity itself has been shown to be very important in causing Alzheimer's disease. This has been shown because genetically caused elevated VGCC activity produces an increased susceptibility to Alzheimer's. And in addition, the VGCC calcium channel blockers are useful for both Alzheimer's prevention and treatment. So this says it's not just intracellular calcium, but actually the VGCCs have important roles here as well. And we've had, and so there are a number of other things. And let me say, I'm giving you these are among the more important of the 18 different types of evidence, but they're not the whole sum of them. But we have had in recent years a decrease in the age of onset of Alzheimer's, and that's difficult to explain, but that is explained, I think, by the EMFs. The timing of this decrease corresponds at least roughly to the timing of the increase in EMFs in our environment. EMF occupational exposures are linked to increased incidence of Alzheimer's. Young people develop digital dementia from long exposures to cell phone and Wi-Fi radiation. So these, we're talking about in some cases teenagers or people in their 20s developing dementia from exposures to cell phones and Wi-Fi. Now, we don't know what the physiology is in these young people developing digital dementia. We just know that they do it and that it happens. So that's something which is, is obviously of great concern. EMF pulses in rats. So let me say there are a lot of studies that have been done on Alzheimer's in animals, where the animals develop things that are essentially identical to Alzheimer's in humans. And rats are one of the organisms which can do this. If you give a series of EMF pulses to rats, given within 1 day, and even within 1 second of 1 day, just on 1 day, okay, just once. And these can cause very early onset Alzheimer's in rats. So this would be, they occurred about 20-month-old rats. They developed these Alzheimer's. This would be approximately the equivalent of 42-year-old humans developing near universal Alzheimer's. And so this is a very early onset Alzheimer's in rats. And the only thing you need to do to convert perfectly normal rats into very early onset Alzheimer's rats is give them a series of pulses within 1 day and EMF pulses within 1 day, and even within 1 second of 1 day. That's all you need to do to convert from one to the other. That's absolutely stunning. The same group that published this, I'm sorry, and all of this is discussed in detail in my paper, so you can look at that. I don't know why. Oh, why is this thing not going? Oh, okay. I guess I can do it that way. Okay. Now, in the same group, instead of giving them pulses in 1 day, started in 1 day, and they started at 2 months of age. 2 months of age are like late adolescent rats, okay, because rats develop very, very quickly. And instead of giving them these pulses in 1 day, they gave them the pulses. They started on the same day, but they gave them once a day. Then instead of coming down with Alzheimer's at 20-month-old rats, they come down to 10-month-old rats. So basically, 8 months later, these rats have extremely early onset Alzheimer's. This would be roughly the equivalent of 21-year-old humans developing universal or near universal Alzheimer's, simply caused from pulses of EMFs. And that's all you have to do. You don't have to do anything else. There was another study that was done. It's a beautiful study, and I don't really have time to talk about it. It was published by Elsevier et al. In 2008. They did not, so these, in the studies that I talked about earlier, they measured things that were Alzheimer's specific in the hippocampus, which is part of the brain that's heavily impacted in Alzheimer's in humans. And in the Elsevier study, they just studied neurodegeneration generally. They did not study anything that was specific for Alzheimer's disease, but they found that very low intensity, this is 3G cell phone radiation, tower radiation, causes universal massive neurodegeneration in these rats. 34% of the brain cells die in 4 weeks. Okay. Now, rats typically live to be about 3 years old, about 36 months. So this is about 2.7% of the lifespan of the rat. They go from being perfectly normal rats to having 34% of their brain cells dead in 4 weeks. This is absolutely stunning. The other thing that's interesting about the Elsevier study is they showed that this entire the process, they measured 11 different things that were involved in this process of neurodegeneration, and they showed that each of them was greatly lowered by using a VGCC calcium channel blocker. Each of these 11 things were greatly lowered. So what is going on here? You're getting VGCC activation. It's producing massive universal neurodegeneration in the brains of these rats. It's just incredible. Now, there's obviously, if we were as sensitive as the rats, we'd all be gone by now, because we're exposed to this kind of radiation all the time. Fortunately, we're not, but that doesn't mean that nothing's going on. And as I said earlier, we know that these EMFs do change the electrical activity in the human brain, so they're impacting our brains. The animal studies and the human epidemiological studies both suggest that EMFs shorten the latency period in Alzheimer's. Why is that important? Well, the normal latency period in humans is thought to be about 25 years. So, for instance, in a situation where one of the things that can cause Alzheimer's in humans is head trauma. So, you have a head trauma, and it typically takes about 25 years for the person to develop Alzheimer's disease. So there's a long latency period involved. The latency period appears to be shortened by the EMFs, probably is something more like 5 to 10 years. So, but it's still quite possible then that we have a new exposure, a new EMF exposure that maybe it's 5G, maybe it's something else that's highly pulsed and therefore highly biologically active. And it could cause universal or near universal, extremely early onset Alzheimer's, but we don't know it yet because we're still within the latency period of Alzheimer's disease. That is a possibility with all of these new kinds of exposures that are coming out all the time. And yet no one is worrying about it. And it is absolutely stunning. I mean, this is so it's quite possible that 5G is doing this. We don't know it yet. It's quite possible that 4G is doing it. It hasn't been out that long, 10, 11 years, something like that. And we don't know it yet. It's quite possible that smart meters are doing it, and we don't know it yet. So, every time that some new kind of EMF is produced, none of them are tested biologically for safety. And any of them might do this. So this is an absolute nightmare scenario that we're talking about, and it is just almost impossible to imagine that we could be doing such things. Okay. Now, so I published on those things. I have not published on autism causation, although I've given a number of talks on this. And so that's my next discussion is autism and its causation by both EMFs and chemicals and how they work. And so this is a figure here of how I think autism works. And I'm not going to talk about everything in this figure, but the basic process, I believe, is the following, that we have both EMFs and various chemicals can act to increase intracellular calcium. And I'll tell you how the chemicals work later on. And that the excessive intracellular calcium in the brain, in the developing brain of both in utero and also shortly after birth, there is a tremendous amount of synaptic formation in the developing brain in humans and in animals at that stage in development. So both late in gestation, the last 3 months, and also in the early life of the child. There are 5 different mechanisms that control the formation of the synapses in the developing brain. So everything in the brain is dependent on the proper formation of synapses between certain neurons and other neurons that they're supposed to respond to. And so there are 5 mechanisms that are involved in the formation of those synapses. They include the dendritic outgrowth of the neurons. They include synapse formation, synapse maturation, synapse elimination, and also something called MCP2 function, which I won't try to explain to you. All of these things are known to be regulated by intracellular calcium. And therefore, when you have excessive intracellular calcium produced either through EMFs or through various chemicals, you will change this synapse formation. And let me just say, in autism, it's known that the connectivity of different parts of the brain, which is impacted. in autism. Some things you get more connections. In other cases, you get, and in most other cases, you get less connections, less synaptic connections. So we know that the brain function is impacted by changes in synapse formation, and we know that these processes are very active, as I said earlier, in the developing brain, and that they are all regulated by intracellular calcium. Okay. So we've already talked about how EMFs do this. I want to say I'll talk about how chemicals act as well. And now, in addition to the usual sort of garden variety types of autism that we see, there are also what are called syndromic forms of autism. And these are caused by germline mutations that affect the synapses. And sometimes they affect them directly and sometimes they affect them indirectly, but they all affect the synapses. But the different synapses in different parts of the brain are different from one another, so they're not all equally affected. And so when you see these genetically caused syndromic forms, they're not identical in their features to the more common types of autism. And those things are caused, but the point is that EMFs may also, through the action of free radicals attacking the DNA, and I'll talk about that later on, they may have roles in producing these germline mutations, in addition to roles on these processes that directly regulate the synapse formation in the developing brain. Okay, so that's now there is clear evidence that that excessive VGCC activity can cause autism. The situation, and this is genetic evidence, there's a mutation in one of these VGCCs. I'm not going to try to explain this nomenclature to you, but it that causes what's called Timothy syndrome, where the channels, when they open, are very slow in closing, and so you get much higher increases in intracellular calcium as a consequence of that. There are also a number of others. There are mutations in a different subunit of the VGCCs that can also cause slowing of the channel. There's another one of these VGCCs. It has very low expression in the brain, but nevertheless, when you get very slow closing of it, it causes symptoms of autism rather than full-fledged autism. And then there's another channel here which indirectly affects these calcium channels, and it also can have roles in causing autism. All of these are genetic studies that clearly demonstrate causation. And let me say, there are also genetic polymorphism studies where more modest increases in activity can cause increased susceptibility to autism as well. So the genetics clearly shows that the VGCCs can have roles in causing autism in this way. Now, how do the chemicals work? And I'm sure quite a number of you are probably interested in chemicals actions in the body, and these are chemicals that were involved in multiple chemical sensitivity, but they also have roles in lots of other things. And they all act by increasing the activity of what are called NMDA receptors. And when those are activated, you also get increases in intracellular calcium here. So each of these pathways, and some of them have, like the mercury and hydrogen sulfide act along two different pathways. The the organochlorines, the organophosphorus and carbamate pesticides, they all act to produce increases in intracellular calcium and consequently nitric oxide as well. And so now it's my opinion that the EMFs are the primary driver of the autism epidemic. Okay, and that that may seem surprising to you. There have been more studies done on chemical action than on EMF action, but that just means they haven't been studied very much. But the reason that it's my opinion that is that the organic solvents, the organic chlorine pesticides, the organophosphorus and carbamate pesticides, all of these compounds here, their synthesis went up. There were huge increases in the production of these things during the 30 years following World War II. But that was really before and so there were plenty of these things out there back in 1975, but that was really before the autism epidemic really got going. So that's not to say that these don't have any role in causing autism, but I don't think they're the primary driver of the epidemic. I think the primary driver of the epidemic are the EMFs, and that but they may act synergistically with these, and we already talked about other synergisms with chemicals. So that's not absolute proof, but I think that's my reasoning for thinking that the EMFs are probably the main drivers of the epidemic. It really has to do with the timing of the autism epidemic, with this huge increase in EMFs that we've been seeing over the last 20, 25 years in our environment. And so that's now. So anyway, so basically what I think is happening is that the chemicals act on this pathway, the EMFs act in this pathway. They both act through intracellular calcium. They both can act to impact the synaptic formation in the developing brain. These things here are things that were discussed in the introduction of my talk, and I'm not really going to discuss them, but I think they're important for understanding what goes on, particularly in autism in older children and in adults, why it stays around so long and keeps impacting. There are ways, I believe, to get improvements in autism, and there are a number of other people who believe that as well. So I don't think it's hopeless, but I think that we have a good understanding of what the primary mechanism is likely to be here. And so, obviously, one of the issues is obvious, and that is that, our latest figures on autism incidence is about 1 in 34 births, but those are all, those are all 8 or 9 or 10 years old. Those are things that, that involve births that occurred perhaps a decade ago. And so the levels of babies being born this year may be vastly higher than that already, based on all the increases in EMF exposures we have. Okay, so there is reason to think that ADHD is also produced by EMF exposure, and this is based on both animal studies and on human epidemiology. And there's one other thing I want to talk about in this context, and that is something that was discussed earlier by Dr. Boyd Haley. Autism is much more common in male babies than in female babies. When you study syndromic autism, which is caused by specific mutations, you can study it in families where it's passed, where the mutation is passed on to both male babies and female babies in the same family. And what you find is that the autism is produced very commonly in male babies, but not in female babies, or in the female babies, if it is produced, it's much milder. So males are more sensitive to developing autism for whatever reason. And Haley has suggested that male dysfunction, which is a very important thing in young males in our society, may be produced by a similar but milder mechanism than what is causing autism. And if that's true, and we have male dysfunction fairly commonly in males in their teens and 20s who were born, obviously, years ago, when we had much lower EMFs. And, and so if this is true, what it means is that male dysfunction will inevitably be getting much worse based on the exposures we've already had as young males develop over time. So this is, so you can see there are all kinds of problems that are where there are highly plausible mechanisms that are generated, and these kinds of things can generate massive impacts. I mean, just one autism child impacts an entire family, and so this is another plausible existential threat, I think, to our survival. Okay, let's talk about cardiac effects. EMFs produce changes in the control of the heartbeat, the electrical control of the heart. They produce tachycardia, very rapid heartbeat. They also produce arrhythmias. They produce, and this typically occurs over time, but not always, they also can produce bradycardia, slow heartbeat. They produce heart palpitations, and they also produce sudden cardiac death. And all these things involve the electrical control of the heart. There are effects that have been studied in animals, both in amphibia and in rodents, where the heart, when you have a heart either in the animal's body or even outside the body, where it has no neuronal connections, that all the neuronal connections have been cut, those hearts can be impacted in these ways by EMF exposures. And it's thought that, and you can do this in anesthetized animals, and you see this. So there's no neuronal thing. So these are direct effects on the heart. And I believe that they are direct effects on the pacemaker cells in the sinoatrial node of the heart, which are the cells that control the heartbeat. Okay, so and what's been shown is that there was an animal study that was shown where long-term EMF effects produce a heart failure-like changes in the structure of the sinoatrial node of the animal heart. So there are studies that specifically implicate the sinoatrial node where the pacemaker cells are occurring as being heavily impacted by EMFs. And anyway, and I believe that the reason that the pacemaker cells are heavily impacted is they have high densities of these VGCCs. And the VGCCs are very, very important in terms of producing these pacemaker activities of these cells. So there's nothing surprising about that in terms of our understanding of the physiology of the system. So now, obviously, when you have EMFs producing heart failure-like changes in the sinoatrial node of the heart, then that's a very great concern because heart failure tends to develop cumulative, tends to get worse and worse with time. And so this can be a big issue. We have an epidemic of young, apparently healthy athletes dying in the middle of an athletic competition. I'm sure you've seen news articles about these things of apparent sudden cardiac death. And so, so this is, and there is, by the way, some evidence from 5G, observations, which I discussed in my, in the paper I published last May, where there is effects on the heart, and so the concern is that we may end up with much higher levels of cardiac effects, including sudden cardiac death, from these new highly pulsed exposures, and that's a great concern. Obviously, and it may even constitute, again, another existential threat to our survival. So let me just say, with regard to these existential threats, one of the things I put in my title, which I don't think I read to you, is this overreach? And I think you need to ask that, am I overreaching on these things or not? And that's obviously an important question that is essential in science. Healthy skepticism is always the basis of good science. Okay, now let's talk about cellular DNA damage of 3 different types. So we have, by the way, the free radical products of peroxynitrite, and it has a carbon dioxide adduct also, are involved in, and they do produce these attacks on the cellular DNA. They can produce both single and double-stranded DNA breaks. They can produce oxidized bases, of which the one that's been studied the most is this one. And so all of these have been shown to occur from EMF exposures, low-intensity EMF exposures in human cells and animal cells. And they in turn can cause both cancer and germline mutations. And so, and obviously both of those things are important. And let me say my concern that I want to discuss here really has to do with the question of germline mutations. So, we have, people all over the world are being exposed to these EMFs. And the question that one has to be concerned about is our gene pool, which is the sum total of all the genes in our germline cells, is it becoming highly degraded? Is the DNA in the gene pool becoming highly degraded as a function of all of these things that are going on with the EMF exposures? And I've looked for evidence in the human genetics literature that would tell me whether we've seen large increases in these kinds of mutations that are produced by these kinds of changes in the DNA. And I have not been able to find out whether there have been large increases in these things or not. And so this has been a matter of great frustration to me. I don't know how far along this thing is. And there are, so I don't really know how, how much we need to worry about that, but it is, at least potentially a very large problem. Okay, now let's talk about cancer. Because cancer is also produced by the DNA effects. It's also produced by other things that EMFs do, which I'm not going to talk about here. With regard to 5G, the millimeter waves that are used for 5G, the electrical parts of those waves are largely absorbed in the outer 1 millimeter of the body, that is basically in the skin. So the electrical parts, the magnetic parts, however, are highly penetrating, and they can both produce effects, but the electrical parts may be expected based on this to produce particularly high effects right near the surface of the body. And so the kinds of cancers that are produced from those cells are the things that we most have to worry about with regard to 5G. And those include melanomas, leukemias, and lymphomas. So melanomas obviously have to do with the skin cells. But it's also true that the white blood cells that are the precursors for leukemias and lymphomas circulate through the skin, and so they're exposed at the surface as well. And so those are the things that probably we have to be most concerned about. Let me just say, Dr. Ollie Johansson has argued that EMFs cause melanomas. And the part of the reason for his argument is that we're seeing more and more melanomas occurring in parts of the body that are rarely, if ever, produced. Rarely, if ever, exposed to sunlight, which has ultraviolet light that can cause the melanomas. So so something else must be causing these, and the obvious explanation is EMFs. That may be another issue here, and that might be obviously very important because the very high intensities by which these 5G are going to impact the outer parts of the body, and that's now. Let me say I was going to talk to you about EHS, and I don't have, I was unable to develop my slides on that. In the paper that I published last May, there were interesting studies which I found, which showed that animal tissues exposed to millimeter waves became hypersensitive to EMFs. And so they were developing EHS-like effects in those tissues. And there clearly the EMFs were causing. And there's other evidence that EMFs cause EHS in humans. And so this is, then the question is, what is happening when EHS is caused by this? And the interesting thing is that there was a study done where the electric organ of the skate, this is the fish that's related to sharks and rays. It has a similar electric organ. It has an electrosensor. The electrosensor becomes hypersensitive from previous EMF exposures. And why is that important? Well, it's important because the electrosensor is known to be a VGCC. It's known to be a voltage-gated calcium channel. And so what that means is the voltage-gated calcium channel is becoming hypersensitive as a function of previous EMF exposures. So we now have, I think, an outline at least for how EHS can be produced by previous EMF exposures. And I suggested in there several things. One is that there is evidence that that this occurs in humans as well, and in human EHS patients, or at least one human EHS patient that was studied by Dr. Waldmann Selsam in Germany. And I suggested in there a possible test for EHS, a simple test for EHS. I won't talk about those, but I believe we're at the point where EHS is something where it's clear that there are effects, that a lot of the effects go through the nervous system, but probably not all of them, because there are cardiac effects in some people with EHS, and that the primary target is probably the VGCs themselves, that they become hypersensitive. And so we now have at least some understanding about how that might happen. Okay, now I'm just gonna, this is my last slide here. And I'm gonna go back to the issue that I started with, the first existential threat being a deterioration of our brain function, as we see from the various neuropsychiatric effects. And just look at some things that have been clearly in the news over the last weeks, months, that are very difficult to explain, but may in fact be explainable through the impacts of EMFs on our brain. So this is speculation, okay? And whether it's good speculation or not, I'll let you decide. But we have things like inexplicable police violence, including homicidal violence. We know there's high-powered Wi-Fi in police cars. There might be a possible role of EHS in addition to direct effects of the Wi-Fi on the brains of the police. Who knows? What you can say, I think, for certain is, if this is right, and I'm not telling you for certain it's right, then the kinds of things that people are thinking about for trying to prevent this aren't going to work. It's simple as that. If you're going to try to prevent this, you've got to deal with the cause. We have large amounts of behavioral problems in schools, in children who've come back to school after the COVID pandemic has at least slowed down. And most of these children spend months, many hours per day at home on Wi-Fi doing distance learning. And yet we have many, many behavioral problems. Is one thing causing the other? Well, we don't know, but it's certainly a possibility. Again, if you don't deal with the cause, you can't get an improvement in it. We've had huge numbers of incidences of inexplicable behavior among both airline personnel and flyers. And we know that there's lots of EMFs in aircraft, particularly produced by the Wi-Fi that's been put into them. And again, with all of these, I think you can think about possible roles of EHS. We had large increases in murder rates in 2020, 2021. Could that be connected? Who knows? We have very large increases in road rage. We know anxiety is one of the things that's produced by EMFs in people, right? That can be involved in all of these things, really. And and what about all the politicians who spend long hours on their cell phones? What may be happening to their brain function, if anything? Okay, so that's all I have to say, and I want to open this up for questions and see what should I
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. So we'll take it from here. Martin, thank you for the presentation. So here, let me see here.
Okay.
Okay, great. All right. So before we begin the Q&A, do you want to tell everyone where they could reach you or where they could find your book?
I don't know whether my book's still available.
See, hold on. We actually we have a screenshot of it. We have it here on our website. Let me share my screen.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm not getting any money from the company anymore, so I'm assuming they're not selling it. I don't know.
Yeah, we found it on Amazon. So if anyone wants to purchase it, you can get it from there, I'm assuming.
Is this an electronic copy?
A paperback and hardcover. I'm not sure if this is.
Oh, so it's still available. Okay.
It's still available, yeah.
And why the hell am I not getting any money from them? Okay.
All right. So so now we'll get to the Q&A. So thanks for sharing that with us, Martin. So we normally don't take questions directly from the chat. What we do is we ask everyone to virtually raise your hand. I see some already in the window currently. If you don't know how to do that, all you have to do is go to the bottom of your screen where you see the reactions tab, then click on the raise hand function in the menu. And from that pops up, we basically see your hand raised. We then take questions in the order in which you receive them. And when it's your turn, we'll unmute you and prompt you to ask your question. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. Are you ready, Martin?
Yep.
All right, let's go. So first question is from Lorraine. Lorraine, what is your question?
Hi, thank you so much for your talk today. My question is, I am going to Africa. My flight will be in 2 segments, total 24 hours flying. Are there any shields that I can purchase that will enable me to block the x-rays while on the plane?
Yes, not x-rays, but yes, you can get shielding. You can get hoods. And I have a hood. I have also a thing where my front of the face is open, so you can read and even eat to some extent. But the rest of your head is probably the most sensitive. You can get shirts that are shielded, and they will protect your torso. By the way, you can also get, and you can get all these things from Less EMF, which I have no commercial relationship with, so I have no conflict of interest here.
How do you spell that?
Just Less EMF, one word. Just Google it. You'll find it. Okay.
Great.
Let me just say something
Thank you so much.
Yeah, let me just say something about shielding and how it works. Okay. I talked about the issue of coherence when I first started talking. And I believe that these shields, which have little tiny metal fibers in them, basically act by disrupting the coherence of these EMFs, because the EMFs are going to bounce off these little fibers in various directions, and they become incoherent as a consequence of that. That's what I think is the main way in which these things work, and there are other shields that you can get as well that probably work similarly.
Thank you for that, Martin, and thank you, Lauren, for that great question. Next, we have Joanna. Joanna, what's your question?
Uh, Hi, Martin. Thank you so much for your presentation. You talked a little bit about EHS sensitivity and the increased sensitivity of the calcium ion channels. I'm somebody who suffers from such sensitivity, and I'm wondering if there's anything that I can do to try to reverse some of that sensitivity, how reactive those channels are.
Yeah, okay. I think you got already from at the beginning that nothing I say should be viewed as medical advice. And I just want to emphasize that. Okay, so what can you do to get improvements? I think there are several things that may be helpful. And let me just say, I was actually contacted by someone who's published on this area on EMFs and has found from personal experience that some of the calcium channel blockers actually help. The problem with those, of course, is number one, they have side effects, and number two, they have to be prescribed. So their availability may be maybe zero. But that's one possibility. I believe that one way that you can get improvement is by raising the level of NRF2 in the body. Okay, so NRF2 is a protein that's produced in the cells of the body. It's NRF number 2, no spaces. I published a paper on this with Stephen Levine in 2015. You can get the paper full text at no cost, either off of Google Scholar or PubMed. Just put my name and NRF2 in there and you'll find it, and you can click on it and get the whole thing. So NRF2 is a transcription factor, and it acts to lower oxidative stress by producing a whole series of enzymes that have antioxidant effects. It also lowers inflammation and lowers NF-kappa B, so it lowers that pathway we talked about. Mm-hmm. It lowers the effects of excessive intracellular calcium in a number of situations. And it also improves mitochondrial function, which is another thing that's negatively impacted. I think that a very large number of the health effects, the things that I believe have been discussed in this group of talks, goes through NRF2. There are many, many health promoting factors that raise the level of NRF2 in our bodies, mm-hmm. and that have been discussed by other people in these talks. And so I believe that that's the primary mechanism by which they act, is by raising NRF2. I believe that that's a very useful thing to do for a lot of different things, but including EHS. So anyway, yeah, okay. I guess.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Joanna, for that great question. Let's see, we have Benny. Benny, what's your question?
Thank you so much, Doctor. I still think the vax has something to do with the autism, but my question is, I never hold my phone up to my head, but is it bad just holding it in my hand? Do I need to wear a protective glove, or what's the radiation just into my hand?
Well, you're getting there. You are getting high level radiation in your hand. Your hand is probably less sensitive than a lot of the other parts of your body, but yeah, you're getting it. I mean, it's a real challenge, and but I'd be more concerned about your head than your hand. I mean, you can't, of course, use it on speakerphone, then it's away from both your head and your hand.
But just carrying it around.
Carrying it around, you get exposed in the body even when it's not on. Yeah. And there's studies that have shown that for example, and the impacts on male fertility, which are substantial, if you carry your phone in your front pocket or clipped to your belt, you have much higher activity than if you put it elsewhere in your body. But on the other hand, if you put it elsewhere in your body, it may affect those things. Like, for instance, you put it in your breast pocket, and your heart can be affected. So it's a huge problem. Now, one thing you can do is you can buy, also from Less EMF, you can buy cases, carrying cases that are shielded on one side but not the other. In which case, if you put the shielding towards your body, and it'll help protect your body from the EMFs when you're carrying it, but you can still get calls. The best thing to do, of course, is to put it on airplane mode, in which case the EMFs are very, very low. But this way you can actually get calls. So anyway, yeah.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, Benny, for that. Thank you, Martin, for answering that. Let's go to the next question. Sophia, what's your question?
Hi, doctor. Thank you so much for taking my question. Please, I would like to know if using radiation-free earplugs for 2 hours, about 2 hours a day, is it safe, both at home and in a car?
Radiation-free. So what are these? These are
earplugs for the ears. Free radiation earplugs.
okay. I'm not familiar with those, but are they air? Basically, are they air driven or?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that should be good. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next we have Marcus. Marcus, what's your question?
Yes, hi, Dr. Pall. Is there anything you can do in your home to neutralize or scramble EMF? Are there any devices that you are aware of?
Okay, let me answer your question first of all. I mean, there are lots of ways in which you can lower exposures in your home, and including the fact that I mean, I use a cable modem, so I don't use Wi-Fi in my house, but I still use the internet all the time, and you can see me doing it right now. And so the exposures are very low. I also use wired devices wherever I can. So I have a wired mouse, I have a wired keyboard, I have a printer that's wired, etc. So wherever you can do that, you know, you can do it. And I use an old-fashioned corded phone, which frustrates people all the time, but that's what I use. And it has much lower EMFs than cordless phones are very, very poorly designed. They're really bad, and I can spend a lot of time talking about them. But okay, but now basically what you're asking me is another question, and that is, are there ways of lowering the effects of EMF fields? And I believe there are. I have not published on this, but there are situations that have been shown in the literature where EMF effects produced by one EMF can be antagonized by a second EMF. And I believe that what's happening is, I talked about the voltage sensor and the movement of these alpha helices. I believe that EMFs can not only cause an activation of the channel by moving these helices out away from the center, but they can also have the opposite effect. They can push them in the other direction if you've got a second EMF that has different properties. So there are a number of devices that have been sold, and I don't endorse any of them, but they may work in this way. And they're called, sometimes they're called shielding devices, but they don't actually shield anything. They may act in this way, and some of them act by producing a second EMF artificially. Others probably act by having little crystals or other things that sort of bounce the EMFs off and produce it in that way. So So I think these may work, and I think that they're worth considering. Okay, but I don't endorse any of them.
Okay, thank you for your answer.
Thanks, Marcus. Next, we have Kaylee. Kaylee, what is your question?
Hi, I'd like to know whether I understood you correctly. And number 7 of one of your slides, from what I read there and from what you said, am I to understand that school children starting work at the computer every day at about the same time every day, that they are subject to developing universal or near universal Alzheimer's by the time they're 21 years of age? And we're allowing this? Even if there's a chance of this?
I think it's quite possible. And it is, yeah, I think it's quite possible based on what we know about Alzheimer's and what we know about EMFs and about what we know about how EMFs impact animals and to a lesser extent how they impact humans. I think it's quite possible. And so it's absolutely unconscionable to even think about doing any of these things without, and so all of these devices are put out without doing one single biological safety test on them. They're put out all the time without doing one single biological safety test on them. It's outrageous. Yeah.
I think unconscionable and outrageous are very kind words for our society to allow this.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kaylee. Next, we have Joel. Joel, what's your question?
Thank you very much for your talk, Mr. Pall. It's certainly a disturbing topic. I have 2 questions that are very integrated. The first is, what science is there and research has been done regarding distance from the source of EMF? So, for example, in my home, I can measure just in the quality of my internet signal as I get farther and farther from the router, the Wi-Fi router, the signal weakens. I mean, obviously, at some point it would disappear or not be measurable. So that's one question: is, you know, if we subject certain human cells or any cells to EMF and we can detect an effect on those cells from EMF, at what point does the effect become tolerable or lessened to a significant degree as far as distance? And then my second question, very related to this, if I think in terms of my own home, or most of us who do use Wi-Fi and have technology in our homes, we have things like microwave ovens, we have routers, we have computers, we have cell phones. I thought I remembered many years ago when I bought my cell phone that it had some type of a rating system that talked about the amount of EMFs that it produces. How can we know what products are safe, and how do we go about measuring the significance of the EMF radiation?
Yeah, we could probably talk about that for days. Let me tell you some of the complications here. Okay, there are many different studies that have shown that you take a particular EMF and you look at how biological effects vary with the intensity of the exposure. Okay, and what you find is that there are what have been called windows of exposure, ranges where you get maximum effects. But when you go lower or higher, they drop way down. So, the dose response curves are extremely complex, and what it means is it's almost impossible to predict what's going to happen. You have to measure it, and so let me just there was a study that was done by I'm sorry, I'm spacing out on the name of by a group in Germany, where it was the senior author was Schwartz, so it was a Schwartz et al. Article. It was published in 2008, I believe. And what they showed was that radiation is very similar to what you get from a 3G cell phone. At great long distances away from it, produced huge effects. And when the industry saw this, they said, oh, they went through the roof, and they tried to say, oh, this couldn't possibly be right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, for various reasons. But it could be right. And I think it was right. And so you can get very strong effects from very low levels of particular EMFs. And it's a function of what kind of pulsation you've got and various other things. So, so it's very difficult to make predictions. Now, obviously, the intensity goes off. It's the inverse square law. The further away you are, the lower it gets. That doesn't mean that the effects go down, to zero until it's extremely low. So, so these are extraordinarily complex things. They really are, and it makes it, and so it makes our ability to predict very difficult. The second thing that also makes our abilities to predict very difficult, or a second thing, is that is the thing I mentioned before, and that is that other EMFs can come in instead of adding to it. They can actually disrupt the production. So, so we have just huge numbers of things, and so I don't, yeah, it's in general lower is better, but but there are lots of exceptions to that. I guess that's about all I can tell you. We're in a crazy situation, really insane.
Thank you, Doctor. Okay, next one up is Wendy. Wendy, I'm going to unmute you if you could please ask your question.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask a common sense question. Maybe I know the answer, but I wanted your professional opinion. I was in Europe, and I happened to come upon some superb medicinal mushrooms, reishi mushrooms. And when I brought it back to the States, I says, oh my goodness, as I went through the check, to board the plane, they put it through the radiation, the box. Mm-hmm. And I asked them, please don't, it's vitamins. Mm-hmm. And they refused. And I didn't really know about the Faraday bags. And also the second part of the question is, I know that, which is good, I'm happy for that, for safety reasons, all our bags that board an airplane are great, I think. So is it kind of foolish? So anyway, I ate my medicinal reishi mushrooms capsules because they were very expensive. And, but I felt foolish because I didn't think ahead. Maybe I should have had my Faraday bags. Could you please answer those two questions? Is it foolish for us to put things on airplanes? Is it going to lessen the nutritional value of the food item? I mean, we're all getting X-rays. I mean, it's like, what's the difference? You know what I'm saying? So please give me your professional opinion about that. Food and X-rays at the airports.
Yeah, I guess it depends a little bit on what. So these are live mushrooms, is that right?
No, they're medicinal mushrooms in capsules, reishi mushroom capsules.
Oh, I don't think I'd worry about them then. So
does it destroy? Is the X-ray very potent that it's going to destroy the potency of the medicinal mushroom, the vitamin?
I wouldn't expect it would. I would think, I mean, the thing I'm concerned about with ionizing radiation actually is when very, very high levels are used to sterilize things, like non-organic almonds, for example, are run through in order to kill insects and things. They use ionizing radiation for that now, and those things are much, much higher intensity. So I'd be worried about that. I don't think I'd be worried about what you're talking about, where you're not talking about living organisms, you're just talking about chemicals. I don't think you're going to see a large effect there.
Yeah, so next time I'll be prepared and bring Faraday bags that would protect it anyway. Am I correct?
Well, it's not a bad idea. Yeah, yeah. Well, the Faraday bags will protect against the EMFs. They won't protect against X-rays, I don't think.
Oh, they won't? Okay, I wasn't sure. I didn't know. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Wendy. The next question is from Christopher. I'm going to unmute you, Chris, if you could ask your question. Christopher? Hello?
Oh.
You must have stepped away. Let me go out and go get Michael instead. Michael, you're next.
Yes. Are you familiar with PEMF devices, pulse electromagnetic field devices? BAMR is probably the best known. Are they of concern?
Well, they're used for therapeutic effects, and I've published on those. They go through the therapeutic pathway that I talked about.
Okay.
So yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, is there anybody else that has any more questions? Doctor is available to answer any questions that you have about the lecture. Let's try, oh, here comes John. Okay, let's John come on back in. Hey, John, how's it going? All right.
Hi, good, how are you?
Yeah.
All right, so Michael, would you like to ask a question? Michael, are you there?
Oh, I just did.
Okay.
No, yeah, Christopher, he's the one that wasn't.
Okay, sorry about that. All right, Chris, do you have a question?
He was MIA too.
So. Oh, that's Mike's. Okay.
Oh.
Oh.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you. It's kind of low, but can you increase your volume a little bit? Can you get closer to the mic?
Yes, I'm trying. Can someone become affected by EMF by sleeping in a room that is exposed to electrical wiring?
Yes. One of the problems that we have, and this is a very, very common problem, is that in our electrical wiring, we have a lot of high frequency transients. And so the electricity, instead of having a nice smooth sine wave like it's supposed to have, it has all kinds of jagged things in it. And so that's been called dirty electricity. And when you have that, and we all have that now, when you have that, then the electric lines become antennae and they irradiate. And I think, you know, if you ever drive around in a car and you got an AM radio and you drive near a high voltage power line, what happens? You get all kinds of static, right? And you get it all over the AM band, right? And that's because those high voltage power lines are irradiating all kinds of different frequencies. So we're getting exposed to an awful lot of stuff that we shouldn't get exposed to, and yes, it causes effects on us, and it causes effects on essentially all other organisms on Earth, certainly in all animals and plants, and it also affects bacteria. So yeah, it's a big problem.
Even if the
Thank you for that. Okay, so the next question is from Joel. I'm going to unmute you if you could ask your question.
Hi, I've been trying to think through some of the policy implications here. You know, all of us are very aware of climate change. We're all concerned about fossil fuel burning and greenhouse gases and so on. And so there's a real push on nationally, I think, and internationally to look toward more of electricity. For example, in my home, I switched from an oil burner to air-to-air heat pumps. These are becoming very popular. And we're also seeing a lot of solar, with people talking about battery storage and massive battery storage, you know, as a future technology. what should we be thinking about here? You know, the trade-offs between some of the fossil fuel burning and its harmful impact versus focusing so heavily, as we seem to be going in this direction, on electricity, as far as the health implications of electricity, EMFs, and so on.
That's a very complicated question, and I'm going to bring in something that I haven't talked about here at all, and that makes it still more complicated. I believe that a lot of the effects that have caused the fires, particularly the fires in California, but also others, to be so severe in areas where we live are actually have to do with the impacts of EMFs on plants, and particularly on very low growing plants near the ground, that they become very flammable, and they also become explosively flammable. That is, they develop compounds that are literally explosive as a consequence of EMF exposures. So why is that relevant here? Well, one of the reasons it's relevant is because a lot of the ways in which we do green energy, and I support green energy, I just don't think we're doing it properly, is that a lot of the green energy, when you transfer, it starts as a DC current and has to then be converted to an AC current, and that's done by using digital inverters, which produce huge amounts of dirty electricity. And so the dirty electricity we talked about is a huge problem as a consequence of that. So these things are very complex, and they're not simple, and they need to be thought of in great depth. And I don't know that we have time to do that here, but so I guess I'm going to punt on your answer, but that's, you know, that's another perspective. Okay.
All right. Seems like we run out of time. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. But yeah, so Martin, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for answering all of everyone's questions, and thank you for your lovely presentation. We want to thank you here at the Real Trip About Health, but I just don't want to thank you. I think everyone else in the audience wants to thank you as well. So audience, what do you have to say?
So